Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Brent Bambury.
Thank you. Thanks. Hello. Welcome. How are you? Okay, so this is an interactive town hall, so I'm expecting a little bit more. So let's try that one more time. Hamilton, how are you? That's it. Great, good. Absolutely excellent. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I have worked at CBC for a long time, and every time I met a Hamiltonian, they would say to me, what the heck? Why does Hamilton not get a piece of the CBC pizza? So I'm delighted to be here at the invitation of CBC Hamilton and to deepen this relationship with this great city. And I'm so glad that so many of you came out tonight to show ownership of this station. And I can promise you that our relationship with this city is going to get even better as the years continue. So I hope that you will be vigorous participants in the discussion that we have tonight. And thank you once again for coming out. I have a lot of affection for Hamilton. I'm actually from the East Coast originally. I'm from St. John, New Brunswick. And the city that I'm from is very similar to this city in a lot of ways. When I was growing up, the #1 industry in St. John was shipbuilding. It was the largest employer in the city. A number of my family members worked for St. John Shipbuilding Company. And in the year 2000, the very final shift at St. John Shipbuilding was worked. And today those dry docks are filled up. There will never be another ship built in St. John, New Brunswick. So the problems that St. John faces are very similar to the problems that Hamilton faces and any number of post-industrial cities in Canada, in Ontario, and in North America. And we'll be talking about some of those issues tonight. So thank you very much for joining us. We have a great panel here. And there was a time here in Hamilton when you couldn't drive on Burlington Street along the harbor at shift time because thousands of workers were on the move. Traffic just ground to a halt. And those were people who were punching time cards or leaving after a long shift or putting in some overtime. Those were Hamilton's heydays. In the 1950s, Industrial Road, as it was called, was home to manufacturing giants. And you know these names: Stelco, Dofasco, Firestone, International Harvester, Procter & Gamble, Westinghouse. They were all part of the fabric of this city. The economy was booming, jobs were plentiful, and in the early 1980s, Local 1005 of the United Steelworkers boasted a membership of 14,000 workers. The ranks were so big, they held annual meetings in Ivor Wynne Stadium. Well, today, a lot has changed. Steel has gone south. The jobs have gone south. Hamilton used to be known as Steel Town, a union town, the cradle of collective bargaining. And what about now? I'm Brent Bambury. I'm host of CBC Radio's Day 6, and today in a special town hall and live webcast, we will examine the future of today's unions in today's economy, in Hamilton and beyond. And today, the majority of unionized workers, some 30% of the workforce, are in the public sector. They work in schools and hospitals, they're civil servants, but we all know about the recent standoff between the Ontario government and teachers. And in the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008, politicians at all levels are talking about cutbacks. This leaves unions with very little room to negotiate in 2013. Less power. Some people question how relevant unions really are. And what's next? What's next for the labor movement? And that's what we're here to find out tonight. So, from the McIntyre Performing Arts Center at Mohawk College, this is a special town hall hosted by CBC Hamilton. Welcome to Labor Pains, Do Unions Still Matter? I'm joined on stage by a panel of 4 people. All of them are deeply engaged with this issue, and I'd like to introduce them to you. Hold your applause until I've introduced them all. Pablo Godoy has been active in the labor movement for nearly half of his life. He's not 30 years old, so that tells you when he started. At 16, he was working at Loblaws. He became a steward for the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. Today, he's their national representative, as well as the vice president of Workers of Color with Ontario's Federation of Labor. Lisa Hammond is president of the Hamilton Wentworth Elementary Teachers Union. She worked with the union for nearly a decade, and beyond that, Lisa taught in middle school in Hamilton, in the Hamilton area. Wayne Luchuk is a professor of labor studies and economics at McMaster University in Hamilton. He's also co-director of a joint university community research program on poverty and employment precarity in Southern Ontario. Wayne's lived in Hamilton for over 30 years. I guess you remember the traffic jams on Burlington then.
Absolutely.
Okay. That's a long time ago. I think Peter Kent was still working at the CBC in those days. And finally, last but not least, John Mortimer is president of the Canadian Labour Watch Association, and that's a web-based resource that helps people who don't want to be part of a union. John's also on the board of directors of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. That's our panel. Please give them a hand. So this is a town hall, and we want to hear from you, whether you're here with us at Mohawk College, or if you're watching our webcast on the internet in places like Windsor, Kitchener-Waterloo, Sudbury, Thunder Bay, or Ottawa. Join the blogs, add your voice to the conversation. If you have a question, if there's something you want to add to the discussion, you can also tweet us on Twitter. We're at CBC Hamilton. The hashtag for tonight's town hall is LabourAunt, all one word. If you disagree with the discussion in this room, please, let's hear from you. The more contentious, the better. We'll get to some of your questions from the floor in just a moment, but first I want to spend some time with our panel. And I'm going to start by asking all of you, each of you, the same question. It's the central question that we're hoping to answer tonight. Do unions still matter? Lisa Hammond, let's start with you.
Well, I think definitely they still matter, but not only do they still matter to union members, but I think they should matter to all Canadians, because I think the alternative to living in a world with, or a country with a strong labor movement is a really nasty alternative.
Thank you. John Mortimer, what about you? How relevant are unions in 2013?
Well, clearly, if you look at union density as a percentage of people working, unions matter less and less. This decline's been going on for a couple of decades in spite of probably 50 years of labor laws and labor boards biased against true, real worker choice. So I think that even our union density is inflated by laws that don't actually respect what workers want. Union leaders are in trouble. Ipsos Reid puts them in the bottom quartile of trusted Canadians as leaders. You know, firefighters at the top at 88%, union leaders at 16% near the bottom. So
firefighters are also union members.
But those union leaders they were asking about and comparing them to firefighters. Okay, I understand they're unionized, but that didn't play into helping union leaders.
Okay. Let me ask you, Pablo Godoy.
Well, unions absolutely matter. We're sitting in an economy that's changing, and there's a shift that's happening with the type of jobs that are available for everyday Canadians. And that shift is happening between good-paying jobs with benefits to a situation where increasingly we see jobs that are low-paying, that have no benefits. And what's happening is that corporations and the right-wing governments are coming together to introduce legislation collectively, and the voice that's missing from this discussion that's being had is the voice of workers. And unions tend to represent and are the voice in this conversation when it comes to labor relations.
Professor Wayne Luchuk, finally, you study labor relations and movements for a living. How are unions doing at this point?
Well, I think the question is, do they still matter? And I suggest they probably matter more than ever. You just have to look at our economy and see where it's going. And well, John's right, the last couple of decades have been tough for unions. It's been a last tough couple of decades for the economy as well, and I don't think that's a coincidence. That as unions have weakened and represented fewer workers, the middle class has disappeared. As the middle class has disappeared, the consumer class has disappeared. As the consumer class has disappeared, the ability of people to buy has disappeared. And as the ability of people to buy has disappeared, the economy has disappeared. So clearly these things are all tied together, and we need to get back to a situation like we did have in the 60s and the 70s. We had strong unions, strong economy, strong society.
So what's at stake for unions if they can't? What happens if they can't recoup that power?
It's not a question what's at stake for unions, and unions themselves are a vehicle to advance the interests of society. It's a question, what does it mean for society? And I think what it means for society is potentially a less equal society, a society where people don't have pensions, fewer have benefits, and where the whole system kind of comes crashing down. And I think it's something that needs to be of concern for everybody, whether you're a union member or not a union member. Right now, the economy is not working.
Lisa, let's look at the struggle that teachers had this year and for the last 18 months. And it's been in the headlines. It's been part of the public conversation in this province and most cities. How would you characterize the struggle that your unions had up to this point?
Well, I mean, I would characterize it as a very, our members are very strong and solid and determined, outraged. You know, I know that it's often characterized, what's been going on as just a collective bargaining issue, but it wasn't about that. We had our democratic rights taken away from us, and we're still determined to get those rights back and you know, to get these things restored. So I think it was a real alarming thing that happened. You know, the government picked out teachers, but it was a divide and conquer approach, you know, as opposed to what had been going on, for example, in British Columbia. They picked out teachers, and teachers were only the first ones, and we knew that, and everyone else knew that as well. So I think that, you know, for us as teachers and union members, not only did we feel that we were fighting for our own rights, but we felt that we were fighting to hold off what was coming for the rest of the public sector.
But in the course of that struggle, because the extracurricular activities were taken away from kids as a result of that, then the discussion was then more than about the collective bargaining rights of the union. It became a social issue. It became an issue of education policy. How do you explain to a kid in the classroom that they can't play basketball because of your collective bargaining rights?
Well, that's a really good question. It's one that we answered quite often. And, you know, what we said was, yes, we think basketball is great, but your democratic rights are fantastic too. And when we look at you, we look at the next generation, we are deeply concerned about what kind of a country you're going to live in. Are you going to have a collective agreement? Will you have any job security? Will there be gender equality on the job? Will you have a pension? So when we look at our students, we're looking at the next generation of workers as well. And we feel very strongly that we have a responsibility, you know, to fight for a better world for them to live in, not to drag them in the race to the bottom as well.
John Mortimer, tell us a little bit more about what you do and why you do it.
Well, maybe I'll tell a brief story. Her name is Sherry. Sherry worked at a restaurant that got unionized by the UFCW. She was of the view, along with her co-workers, that they had been organized fraudulently with a union organizing tactic called card fraud. Sherry and her fellow workers wrote a letter to the Ontario Labour Relations Board, who completely ignored them. Sherry worked there for 5 more years, decertified the union. I went down and met her and asked her why she did it. She said, "Look, John, I come from a union home. My mom and dad both work in unionized jobs. I'm not an anti-union person. But no union should get into a workplace like this, and no government agency should ignore someone like me. So on a point of principle, I stayed here for 5 years, and I got rid of this union." They reduced her to tears. They put her co-workers in cars at night and intimidated them, and they still lost the decertification vote in the end. And so Labor Watch came into being in many ways because of that story of Sherry's, and that there was really no vehicle, no place for people to find out their rights to not be unionized, to cancel a union card. You know, when a union leader says you can't cancel your card and you can't get it back, that's a lie.
So what's your biggest, if you could boil it down to a single complaint, what is your biggest single complaint about unions in 2013?
Union leaders have coercive powers in this country that most every other nation on earth has taken away from them and protected worker choice. Unions have no place taking forced union dues and using them to fund the breakup of this country, to fund violent student riots in Quebec, criminal activity funded by major Canadian unions. That's wrong. No worker should be fired for funding the breakup of Canada.
Okay, let's take it to Pablo. Just hold on. Let's take it. Good. All right, Pablo, would you respond to what John just said?
Well, I'd love to respond to his story with another story of mine that I have. And my story is not named Sandra, but the person in the story is named Sandra. And it's a woman that came here from Guatemala as an immigrant and fought her way to get her credentials actually recognized so that she could work in as a social worker. She got a job as a social worker, and what she found there was rampant discrimination, theft of wages, unfair labor practices across the board, and extreme racism because of her language barriers. And so what she did is she called somebody by the name of UFCW, Local 175, and was able to negotiate a contract that actually respected all the things that had been negated or violated by her employer. And that lady is Sandra Godoy, my mother, and that's one of the reasons why I strongly support UFCW and unionization itself. But in terms of the importance of unions and why I do what I do, is that increasingly what we find, and I represent a lot of young workers, what we find is young people are at the bottom when it comes to being the most vulnerable workers, not having access to good jobs, coming out of university with extreme debt, and not having good jobs to pay that debt or find careers to subsist. And so what we see is there's a lack of importance placed on the voice of workers. So we can talk about workers' choice, but that choice also involves a choice to be respected in the workplace, have a voice that can negotiate these things and enforce them when violations of contracts or law is taking place in the workplace.
What about the issue, though, that John mentioned, the funding of issues that aren't necessarily related to what appear to be the interests of the union collecting the dues? For example, funding student protests in Quebec. What about your union? How do you know where your union dues are going? And Lisa, how do you give consent to the union to take part in that kind of a protest?
Well, I mean, we're a democratic organization, and our members elect an executive, and we are charged with the responsibility of the budget, and we report to our members, and our members vote for us, and they vote for these things, and we are not only concerned about our own members as unions, and I think this is very much the case of unions in this country. Throughout the history of the labor movement in this country, we are not just concerned about union members. We're concerned about the community in general, right? We don't just want to raise the standard of living for our own members. We want to raise the standards for everyone, everywhere. So
but are the standards of transparency there in terms of what your union decides they would lend credence to in terms of funding?
Absolutely. Our members have access to all of that information.
Wayne, let's talk about what some of the, this is a lot of very contentious issues, and they're the issues that I think are driving a lot of the problems that the labor movement has right now. What do you see when you hear these issues being raised?
Well, I think the issue is not whether unions are perfect, because I'm happy to admit they're not perfect, and they make errors, and there's some unions that perhaps don't do what we like them to do. The question is, do unions as a whole make our society a better place? And there I think there's absolutely no doubt about it, that unions as a whole do make our society a better place. It's very clearly they even out the income distribution, so they lift people up into the middle class. They allow people to avoid harassment and discrimination at the workplace in a way that they wouldn't without them being there. They foster democratic debate. To suggest that somehow unions are out there and their goal is to blow up the country and whatnot, that's scandalous. It's certainly not the union people that I know that are out there. They care deeply about their members and about the country, and they're taking positions, and it's part of the debate. And they need to have the resources to be able to have that voice. To be frank, in a country where increasingly it becomes difficult to have a voice.
Okay, so income disparity, I think, is a big issue in Canada and also in the United States. So talk a little bit about that. John, how do you see, if you remove unions from the picture, how do you see that helping the widening gap of income disparity?
Well, the first thing, I'm not talking about a regime that removes unions from the picture.
No, but that's not what I'm suggesting either. I'm just saying if unions become less powerful, then doesn't that gap become greater?
I think that CUPE should not focus on bottled water and spending money on the Vancouver International Film Festival.
Okay, but we're talking about income disparity. Let's talk about income disparity.
No, but I think it should
not. No, but let's talk about that.
Okay.
Just address it for me. If
I think
unions become less powerful, does the gap become?
This idea that the unions created the middle class, I don't know what the basis is for it. I think this is one of the great shibboleths of the labor movement.
Okay.
Okay?
Continue then. Describe that.
Okay.
Why is that?
The province with the lowest minimum wage, we paid the highest wages to at companies that I worked at, okay? Because the economy was strong in that province, okay? It wasn't interfered with in ways inappropriately by government. There's a lot of things. The number one complaint that almost every labor board in this country receives is a complaint from a unionized Canadian against their union. Far eclipses all others. What's going on there? You look at the research on job satisfaction and job engagement, the greater the rate of unionization, the lower the rate of engagement and job satisfaction. Why is it good sending people to an environment like that and then they go home from that? These are the numbers. These are the numbers from 250,000 Canadian workers. Okay, so there's a lot of things that are not being discussed and are not out on the table because there isn't enough voices bringing that, and a lot of unionized Canadians are very dissatisfied with their union leadership.
So I'm going to go back to you, Wayne. What are the weakest links for the labor movement right now?
Well, I think right now the weakest link is the fundamental restructuring in the labor market and the shift away from places like Stelco that used to have 13,000 workers to people working through temp agencies on short-term contracts. And the whole labor law system is set up to accommodate people who have a fixed workplace and they're there for a lifetime. Right now, people move around from one workplace to the next, and it's really almost impossible to organize these workers. So the whole class of workers that we now call precarious, they're basically outside of the union fold because there's just no way for unions to really tap into them. And there are various groups that are working on this in the arts. I suspect a lot of the people at the CBC who would have been here 30 years ago would have had a full-time permanent job. Right now, they're probably on contracts. But their unions are looking for different ways in which they can represent these kinds of workers who are on contracts. So I think the biggest problem they have right now is the change in the nature of employment and that the rules are really made for a different era.
Lisa, you're the only woman that we have on the panel tonight. I just have to point out that because as the head of the elementary teachers local, the vast majority of your members are women. Yes. And over the years, the labor movement's made a lot of gains for women, better wages, access to childcare, other benefits. But those battles are over. They were hard fought, but they seem to be over. So what do you see? Okay, that's all right. Then what do you see then? Maybe I'm wrong. Then
well, I mean,
obviously some people here.
We're living in a country where women, make 72 cents to every dollar. And I think, unfortunately, the only thing that changes that is the driving down of men's wages as well. And so what I know is that the only guarantee in this entire country that I have, that I will have gender equality in the workplace, is my union collective agreement. Right. That is the only thing that guarantees me equality in the workplace.
Audience, I'm going to take questions very shortly, so I would prefer if you were going to ask a question to come to the microphone and ask the question. We'll definitely put it to the panel. But if you'd like to participate, there are 2 reporters in the audience, and they will just flag them down. They'll take you to a microphone, and we'll take your questions then. We'll have a quick chat, all right? And if you're participating on Twitter, at CBC Hamilton, #LaborAunt, this is Labor Pains. Do unions still matter? And this is a town hall and webcast, which is hosted by CBC Hamilton. We're on stage here at Mohawk College. We have an audience who's very engaged in the topic so far. Are you enjoying it? Yeah. Good. I hope to hear more from you. And we have 4 guests here. Pablo Godoy is the national representative of the Canadian Food and Commercial Workers. His work focuses on the rights of migrant workers, youth, people of color. Lisa Hammond is president of the Hamilton Wentworth Elementary Teachers Union. Wayne Luchuk is a professor of labor studies and economics at McMaster University in Hamilton. John Mortimer is president of the Canadian Labour Watch Association. And throughout the evening, I will be speaking with some invited guests that we have with us here in the front row. Rolf Gerstenberger is a longtime president of the United Steelworkers Local 1005 here in Hamilton. And before the first recession in 1981, they had more than 14,000 members. That was when they had to hold their meetings in Ivor Wynne Stadium. And today, Hamilton's oldest union has been reduced to 600 members. So as the numbers have dropped, so has their hold on power. And Rolf Gerstenberger joins us now. Rolf, hi. How are you? Thank you for coming.
Hello?
Hi. We can hear you.
You can hear? Oh, okay.
Good. Nice to have you with us. So last year, when you were acclaimed as president of the local, you said, "We face an uncertain future." How uncertain is it?
Well, it's very uncertain, mostly now because we're part of the U.S. Steel Empire, and basically they can decide from Pittsburgh whether we exist or not. And, right now, the way the steel industry is in North America, it's about 75%, 80% capacity. They could decide, well, we don't need the 2 million tons that we could produce. So this is the real uncertainty. Like when we had the 11-month lockout, they were just able to, they locked us out. We didn't go on strike. They were able to ship the steel up from the States and satisfy their customers. And until they got what they wanted in the contract, and that was basically they won a concession that the next generation doesn't get a pension plan. We've had a pension plan since 1955. And then they also eliminated indexing from pensioners.
Let's talk about the pensioners, because I think there are 8,500 pensioners right now?
Yeah, about 8,700, yes.
And they're still active in the union. They don't pay union dues, obviously.
No.
And you're down to 600 members. So going forward, how can you carry that? How can you look after those pensions?
Well, the way we do it, which is we encourage all unions to do it, is we involve our pensioners. We have weekly meetings where we discuss the problems we face and how we're going to deal with those problems. We have 50 to 100 workers, pensioners participate every week. So when Mr. Mortimer, attacks unions, we have a forum where all of our members and all of our pensioners can participate to raise their concerns, and that's where we discuss how we're going to proceed, whether we're going to support different issues, whether we're going to participate in the life of the country.
But some of your pensioners are very young. Like many of them are just over 50 years of age.
Yes. Yeah.
So is retraining part of the program for you?
Well, not for us. Most of the pensioners, I mean, they're trying to, if the pension isn't enough to live on, they're trying to find jobs somewhere else. Once they've made their decision to retire, so most of them are just retired. But at the same time, they're also still very involved in the society, and as Lisa mentioned, we're also very concerned about the future of Canada. Okay. So that's how we look at life.
Thank you for being with us tonight, Rolf, and maybe we'll hear from you again later on in the evening. Rolf Gerstenberger is president of Local 1005, United Steelworkers of Hamilton. And I think it's time to start taking some questions from this audience, because I can feel you chomping at the bit. So microphone number 2, is that where we are? Do we have somebody at mic number 2? Hello? Hi, come over to the microphone and please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Rob DeBrucki. I'm a member of Service International's Employee Union. I want to ask Mr. Mortimer a question about what he calls the right to work, and the phrase that he used was a worker's choice. I heard a speech from somebody who was a leader in the steelworkers in the South. All the states there are what they call right to work. He talked about the fact that there he has a duty to represent 65,000 members, but collects dues from only 55,000. And if any of his staff reps don't represent one of those 10,000 that aren't paying dues, they have the right to take the union to the Labor Relations Board equivalent there and have a prosecution done and a damages awarded for not representing them. So, I mean, I hear the phrase right to work and workers' choice a lot, but what I never hear talked about is the fact that, as I understand Mr. Hudak's proposed legislation in Ontario, it still requires unions to represent everyone, but they don't have to pay for the services they're getting. I mean, the phrase right to work is used a lot, but wouldn't you agree that a more fair way to describe it is right to take a free ride? The right to demand that union represent you if you have a complaint about what's going on in the workplace, but you don't have to pay for it the way that most of your coworkers do.
Thank you, Rob. Job, would you like to answer that question?
I'm going to recommend a column of Randy Hillier's in the Windsor Star, okay, the labor critic for the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party, to you, that I think is more representative of what I think Hudak is talking about, and it's more European or even New Zealand in its model. I am not a believer and an advocate in the American right to work model. I don't believe a union should have to represent someone who doesn't pay, but I believe that someone who's not a member of the union and someone who doesn't want to pay the union is not represented by the union, is not covered by the collective agreement, like in New Zealand, okay? Certain countries in Europe, if you don't join the union and you don't pay dues, you're not represented by them. They don't have to grieve for you. That's what I mean by worker choice, okay? No one should be fired because they lose their union membership because they got offside the union boss, like Walter Speckling from Powell River. No one should be fired because they don't pay their union dues to fund the riots in Quebec or any social cause that a union's involved with that has nothing to do with representing them at work. This is Sweden, this is Russia, this is Italy. We're the last country on earth, hear me, the last country that allows an employer and a union to agree that a worker has to join a union and remain a union member or be fired.
Wayne?
We're the last nation on earth that allows an employer and a union to agree to take money from a worker's paycheck and do anything outside of the bargaining unit and representing them. And that's not what Justice Rand intended. Union leaders, if you have not read the Rand formula, read it.
Okay, Wayne, we're talking now because you framed us as a global anomaly. I'd like to hear from Wayne on this, and then we'll.
Well, I mean, actually, I did bring along the Rand formula. It's in my pile of documents right here.
Could you, very briefly, could you explain what the Rand formula is?
What Rand basically, this is Justice Rand, and there was a strike at the Ford Motor Company in late 1945, early 1946, over the right of the union to exist. And what Justice Rand argued is that, look, there's no way that you can separate out the benefits union members and non-union members get at the same workplace. So if a union makes the workplace safer, it makes the workplace safer for everybody, basically. If a union wins gains such as a pension or better wages, they may not be automatically transferred to the non-union member, but the reality is they're going to get those gains as well. So there's no way you can separate out the gains the way John is suggesting. And therefore, Justice Rand's proposal was, well then, it should be that everyone should be responsible for paying the cost of running the union. And that's basically a system that we've had in place now in Canada since 1946, and it's worked very well. And if I just might say, this notion that somehow union members pay dues and it goes into Ralph's pocket and he just decides to go out and do whatever the hell he wants to do with it is I think, somewhat inaccurate. I think Ralph is bound by his membership and votes they have and whatnot, and they collectively decide what to do with that income. And so if they decide they think bottled water and plastic, or water in plastic bottles is bad for the environment, that's certainly a position a union is entitled to take. And they take that in the interest of their members and the interest of future Canadians. And so I think one has to be very cautious about how one characterizes unions, and I think they're being misrepresented.
Thank you, Wayne. There's a lot of ways to get involved in tonight's conversation. You can see that there's a vigorous conversation going on online, concurrent to this one. If you're here in the audience at Mohawk College, signal to one of our audience producers and they will come to see you, and you can give us a question as Rob just did. But if you're watching us live online, you can also add your comments via Twitter. We're at CBC Hamilton, #LabourAunt. This is Labor Pains. Do unions still matter? It's a special town hall live webcast hosted by CBC Hamilton. I'm Brent Bambury. I'm the host of CBC Radio's Day 6. And throughout the discussion, we've been receiving comments and reactions from people on Twitter and online. And the CBC's Julia Chapman is monitoring the chat. She joins me now. Julia, where are you?
Well, we had, as you said, very vibrant conversation happening online. Lots of people joining us from Hamilton, but also from across Ontario. We have live chats going on in Thunder Bay, Sudbury, and Windsor as well. But the most recent conversation is about public sector unions versus private sector unions. And I'd like to share a comment with you from Nancy, who is joining us in our live chat. And she says, public sector workers have to start facing the reality and stop listening to their unions. They, the workers, have been promised benefits that are unattainable, and as a result, they lose their seniority. With those with lower seniority are losing their jobs, and there is no money left for the young people who are coming out of university with large debts. They keep bragging about their defined pension plans and suggesting that everyone else should have them too. The private sector workers are not going to tolerate this much longer, and public sector unions and the governments that have to pay or have to put up with power that are responsible for the mess that our economy is facing today. And another commenter on our live blog responded to Nancy saying, yes, it is factory workers that need unions and not civil service like me. So that's the conversation that's going on online right now. And again, if you want to contribute, you can type a comment or a question for our panelists into the live chat right below the picture where you can see me, or you can join us on Twitter at CBC Hamilton, and please use the hashtag LabourONT. Brent?
Thank you very much, Julia, and we'll certainly talk about public sector unions in just a moment. I think we have one more question from the floor. Hello, what's your name, sir?
Yes, my name is Henry Hind. I'm a former steelworker.
Thank you for being with us.
I worked in local 1005.
And what's your question?
And my question is to the
Mr. Mortimer?
Guy on the right
Okay.
hand side.
Okay.
My question is about US Steel. As soon as they got Lake Erie Works and Hilton Works, the first thing they'd done was shut down Lake Erie Works, that never in its history have ever been shut down. Never had a strike, and nothing was done by the government about their decision to shut down Lake Erie Works. In addition to that, when I worked in Hilton Works many, many moons ago, there was 11,600 people in that facility. We made lots of steel. And now, this company from the US has just taken away the facility in Hilton Works. It's nothing like it ever had been. And the government has never done anything about that. So how would you solve that problem of people, 11,000 in Hilton Works and 3,000 or 4,000 in Lake Erie Works, and now you can see what's been done in Hamilton. And the fact that Hilton Works has been dragged right down, there's a whole bunch of other companies that worked in Hilton Works, provided all kinds of services for them. And that isn't happening now. And there's a hell of a lot of people unemployed and underemployed in this country. And I want to hear why you say people shouldn't make a decent wage, decent benefits, decent holidays, and all the things that we've managed to grow, and now it's crumbled.
John Mortimer, please.
Well, first of all, I didn't say some of the things that you're attributing to me, okay? I'm not sure what I'm talking about has relevance to a changing economy. There's a lot of change in technology in the steel industry that has led to a change in the number of jobs. You know, one of the things that I think is problematic about what union leaders have done is they actually do stand in the way of technological advancement and change. Do you want your music digitally, or do you want no music at all? Do you want records with scratchy sound? What about all the workers that made records? What about the people that made DVDs that are now being downloaded? Is the government supposed to mandate that an employer continue to make records so that the people who make records, however many thousands of them there were in the world, are still making records? Is that what you're asking? I think not. And it's not going to happen anyway, because you will not stop change, and you will not stop advancement. And there's a lot of things in your lives that you love very much, and you're really glad that someone invented them. But there's lots of workers that got displaced because those things got invented and got created.
I want to talk to Kevin McKay. Are you here, Kevin? Kevin is, he teaches humanities and social science right here at Mohawk College, and you're also the communications officer for the union that represents the faculty here. And I'm curious about the situation that our guest just described, or the gentleman at the microphone just described, which is the disappearance of certain securities that come with good jobs, that come with union jobs, the fact that the union job, that the job that might replace a union job won't pay the same benefits and won't have the same security. How does that fit into your experience?
Sure, I could comment on that. And I think maybe, if it's okay, I'd like to spin that into a little bit of a response to something Mr. Mortimer said. I think he mentioned something about the shibboleth of this idea that unions actually provide benefit for workers. I think that needs some comment. I think that, you know, what you're hearing about the transition that's happening in the labor market right now from well-paying jobs with benefits, with a certain amount of security and protection towards more precarious employment, more part-time employment, you know, fewer benefits, less wage being paid as well. That, in many ways, is the difference between a unionized and a non-unionized job. And I just sort of say, as someone who teaches, you know, the sociology of work and the history of the labor movement, one of the most easily verifiable things, in terms of the history of Canada, not just Canada, but the industrialized world, is the undeniable gains that unions have made for working people. Whether you talk about a 40-hour work week, whether you talk about an 8-hour workday, whether you talk about health and safety legislation, whether you talk about the union premium on wages, which is just an ironclad fact across almost every country I've looked at. Unions very clearly benefit their members over non-unionized jobs. So I think that's just something that, statistically speaking, you almost can't even argue with. The other thing I just want to say, though, too, is that historically speaking, the labor movement was a part of a broader social movement. And so the labor movement is also, in many ways, the movement that brought us public health care in Canada, that brought us Social Security. And so it's not unusual, then, for workers to also be supporting movements for social equality in other areas. The unions have supported the LGBTQ movement. Unions have supported the women's movement. Unions have supported, movements that we've seen recently in terms of student rights. So this in no way is, I don't think, anomalous to what the labor movement has always been about.
But what about what John talked about in terms of globalization, in terms of technology, and changes that actually move jobs around, that move manufacturing to different countries? How can you reconcile that level of change with the demands of the wages and the benefits that cost money that are connected to a union job when the manufacturing base is disappearing or is moving offshore?
Sure. I think globalization is a classic ploy that's often used by the right to attack unions as being Luddites, which I think is something Mr. Mortimer suggested, or being in the way of progress. I think actually what unions really do is say, okay, if there's going to be advancement and change in this sector, who is that going to benefit? Is it going to benefit just the employer? Is it going to benefit just a few shareholders on a corporate board? Or is it actually going to benefit the working people who sort of produce the wealth? And so my sense is really unions, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. Unions have an interest in their company being successful, but what they have an interest in really seeing is that success actually flow out to not just the workers who work there, but also the communities in which that work takes place. And so I think that really is, again, I'm sorry, I think it's a bit of a myth that unions somehow stand in the way of progress. What they stand in the way of having jobs outsourced, to a situation in a country where maybe workers can be paid 1/3 or 1/5 the wages. And I think that is something all Canadians should be concerned about. That's why we've seen the hollowing out of our manufacturing sector, and I think that's why we're seeing, the continued degradation of jobs available for Canadian workers.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
Jake is at the mic. Jake? Hi. Sorry again, please.
My question is, I first of all want to talk about Mr. Mortimer saying unions are bullies. Meanwhile, I just watched the government bully QP and the Teachers Association to take a contract that they didn't negotiate and work them back to work. That's the first mistake. If there's anybody going to be a bully, what's failed this economy is foreign investment. The Canadian Business Investment Act have allowed foreign investment to come in here, make promises they don't live up to, and tell people, and I'll give you our example, they promised that they could afford our pensions, they were going to employ 3,150 people to work here, make this economy better. U.S. Steel's failed this economy. To blame the union for what they reneged, there should be a fine. That's criminal what they do to allow a pensioner that hasn't got a right to fight back, which our pensioners do. They haven't got to say they retired, where it was irrevocable, what they were going to receive, this much money, these much benefits, and now the federal and the provincial government are stripping of their dignity. So someone to say that the unions are bullies, the unions negotiated those across the table, fair and square. The union lived up to their deal to go into the factories, work shifts, work weekends, don't see their kids grow up and everything else. And now to say that the unions are bullies, the unions are needed more now to keep the government honest. The Canadian Investment Act is failing the Canadian people.
Okay.
Until we get up here and sit there and blame a union leader, let me give you one more example. Any resolution or any money spent to go to any of these rallies, conventions, and everything else is passed at a membership meeting. You want to listen to HUDAC? We have financial reports monthly. So for us, I think it's not the union. If the unions weren't here, these people, the foreign investment, would be destroying. They destroyed Sudbury with Valley Inco. They're trying to destroy Hamilton with U.S. Steel and Natico.
Let's give Mr. Mortimer a chance to respond to some of what you said. Okay,
Yeah,
I just
well,
want
I'm gonna
to
get them all to respond if you can.
let's ask. Is federal policy hurting working people?
Well, look, I'm not an expert on federal policy.
First of all, they made a commitment, okay? They made a commitment to employ 3,150 people, keep that place running for 3 years.
Have an answer?
John, yeah,
Are we going
go
to have an
ahead.
answer? The laborers, there's a laborers local in this country that didn't hold a union meeting for 15 years. I've got a letter here from a CAW member. Just a moment. The financial statements were not handed out to members. Instead, the handouts were read out loud by a trustee. There were two different sets of financial statements.
Okay.
This CAW member.
No, let's all right. Let's just stop for a moment. I have to ask you for a question because let's have a question.
Okay, the question has, why doesn't the federal government, when it allows foreign investment here, live up to their promises they came? And when they don't live up to their promises, send them back home where they came from and have someone else.
Okay, good. John, can you respond to that, or do you feel qualified to respond to that?
No, I don't feel qualified to respond to that. The
Then
whole
let me ask.
complicated dynamic.
Do you mind if I pass this question to Wayne Luchuk then? Wayne, could you address it?
Yeah, the issue is there was a condition
gonna ask
upon
Pablo.
the sale of U.S. Steel, or Stelco to U.S. Steel. There were guarantees of employment levels, and those employment levels have not been respected. And when the federal government took U.S. Steel to court, they let them off with a wing and a promise to do something in the future. And I think it is scandalous that they made a commitment to employ 3,000 people, and they employ 600.
Pablo,
it's a contract. It's a contract. They violated it.
Talk a little bit about what is the present relationship between the federal government and governments elsewhere in Canada, other provincial governments, and the labor union and the labor movement at this point.
Well, I think there's a bit of a disconnect, and that disconnect is because the voice, again, that I like to always bring up is the voice of workers, and it's one that's usually not asked to be at the table when it comes to governing or when it comes to putting into place policies or legislation that affect workers directly. What we see today is governments, whether federally and provincially, enacting legislation and laws that move towards preferring or creating a system that gives incentives to employers to create low-paying jobs with no benefits. And those programs are, or legislations like last year that was passed, that temporary foreign workers program, let's say, employers can actually pay temporary foreign workers 15% less the going rate of any other Canadian. That's an incentive, right, that employers are being given. In a profit-driven country or society, employers are going to see that and obviously think that's a method that you use to keep wages down. Provincially, what we see is, you can take Ontario, for example, who has this $14 billion deficit and wants to attack public sector unions and public sector workers as if they were the scapegoats or the reason that this deficit exists. And that's simply not true. Ontario provincial and federal governments have a history of corporate tax cuts that increase the deficits, that have kind of reduced the amount of money that's actually coming into governments that actually allow for investment in social welfare programs. And so the corporate world would have you believe that it's the average worker who has caused these deficits, and it's the average worker who has to pay and contribute to build back society. And they have never stopped paying or working or paying their fair taxes. What has to happen is a restructuring and a redevelopment of commitment to corporations who are giving tax cuts with no necessarily bonds or aren't necessarily being held to the fact that they're supposed to bring jobs. And those jobs should be a net gain. And those tax cuts should come along or coincide with some type of obligation that they bring this and some type of proof, mechanisms that ensure that these jobs are actually being created and not just give out these tax cuts that leave provincial governments in deficits or without the money that they have historically been able to obtain. And one example is the cutting of corporate taxes here in Ontario. If you were to restore the corporate tax level to back to 2009 figures, you'd be talking about a $2 billion income to the Ontario provincial government, right?
We have lots of questions in the room, and I'm going to go to this person over here. Hello, what is your name?
Hi, my name is Naduk. I'm a resident of Hamilton. This question, I guess, is to the panel, but probably directed more to you, Pablo, and you, Wayne. I studied labor relations for a long period of time, and it was interesting to see the evolution of it. And my study progressed to look at how unions here worked with unions abroad. And that's something that I think sort of is related to the question and commentary that's been taking place as to foreign investment that comes into Canada, as well as Canadian investment that goes abroad, and what those relationships are that perhaps you can provide some insight into unions mattering not just here, but also as a larger network to protect those rights.
Wayne?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to that question, if I understand it fully. I mean, one is increasingly unions are organized on a national basis, not all of them, but a lot of them, and sometimes there are difficulties competing across those national boundaries. But the other part of it, I think, which is really quite relevant, is that unions in Canada have lent a hand to unions in other places. For instance, the CAW, very involved with unions in South Africa. The steel workers have been very involved with unions down in Mexico. And it's that kind of solidarity to try and protect the rights of the working class across the world that, in fact, allow us to maintain our standard of living. Because the reality is, if workers in one area are forced to accept subsistence wages, it's going to be making it more difficult for us to maintain our wage standards. So you're absolutely right. There has been that international cooperation. And again, that's spending union members' dues on things, but I think it's absolutely essential to do that.
I'm going to go back to Julia Chapman because she's been following the discussion on Twitter and the reaction that we're getting in the Twitter sphere. Hi, Julia.
Hi there. Now, since you last came to me, the conversation has drifted quite heavily to the image of unions, how they are perceived. Tom Forsyth in our live chat says, like all mobs, unions draw their power through inflaming the passions of the group and intimidating the individual. And another commenter on our webpage says, unions have been important, but they should try to create positive working environments instead of opposing almost everything. I sincerely believe they have to look outside the box and create positive work attitudes and environments, or they will continue to kill jobs because of their dogmatic approach. Just some of the conversation that's going on online in our web chat, also on our webpage. And of course, if you want to contribute to that chat, please feel free. You can type your comment in the box right below where you can see the picture of us right now, or you can contribute on Twitter. Use the hashtag LaborOnt, that's Labor O-N-T.
Thank you very much, Julia, and thanks to everybody online who's participating and joining in the chat tonight. We're going to go back to the panel now and take a look at the complicated and lengthy relationships between governments and labor. The union's traditional ally, the NDP, is not necessarily the friend that it once was. Here in Ontario, public school teachers were recently locked in a protracted dispute with the provincial Liberal government, and the Conservative opposition, as we've been talking about, has plans to radically change labor laws if they assume power, with proposals including ending mandatory union membership, requiring unions to disclose their revenues, more transparency in how they spend their money, and also ending mandatory payment of dues. So let's talk to you, Lisa, about the teachers and their long dispute. The teachers' union have been fighting it out with the Ontario Liberal government. What do you think the formula is for governments and unions to get along?
Well, I think respecting unions, I think, is probably the most important part of the formula. It's an interesting situation, definitely, that's going on right now politically. But what we're looking at as a union is we're looking at what the agenda is, right? So we're looking at the austerity agenda that we're facing, and we have to ask ourselves which political party or which politicians are going to step up and face that agenda and start having a conversation about what the agenda actually is. Because if we don't start dealing with that, we're not going to move anywhere on this issue.
But what's the role of the union in facing the austerity agenda?
Well, I mean, our role is to resist it. And our role
How
is...
realistic is that, though?
Well, I mean, it's absolutely realistic. That's what we do. Unions have always resisted. Unions have always faced these agendas. This is nothing new for unions to fight back against these agendas and to move forward on them. But I think that what we are looking at in the labor movement, especially now, is it's one thing to look at a political party, but it's another thing to look at community activists and building coalitions. And I think that's something that unions are very much engaged in and need to be very much engaged in the years ahead. We need to look for our allies, and those allies are not necessarily going to be in a political party. They may be the community activists. They may be other organizations in the community, and that's what we're looking for. That's one of the reasons why we put our resources into supporting community organizations.
But don't, I mean, a lot of what you need to accomplish, isn't it winning over also the citizenry, the people who use your services as taxpayers, as mothers and fathers of kids in school? Don't you have to also wage a PR battle to bring them on side so that they understand why you're fighting for what you're fighting for?
Well, I mean, absolutely, that is something that we are constantly working on, but we also have to realize that we are those mothers and fathers as well. We are that public as well, right?
But are you winning that battle, do you think?
I just want to say that, the separation in the language, describing union members and as though they're not members of the community is something that I think that needs to be addressed, because we are also members of the community. Mm-hmm. And the propaganda that's out there, the onslaught against unions is very strong.
What are you doing about it? I'm interested in how do you address it?
Well, here we are, right? We're having these conversations. And I think we need to pose the question to people. We get caught up in this question about, do you like unions? Do you prefer a union? Would you like to work in a union place? Would you like to not have a union in your life? When the question really is, do you want to live in a country that suppresses and oppresses and criminalizes the labor movement? Because that is what's going on all over the world. And do you want to live in a place like that? Because when you look at those places, when you look at what they look like, that is not the kind of place that most Canadians would want to live. So I think that is the question that we need to ask, and that is, that's the question that we need to ask everybody.
Wayne, do you think public service unions are doing a reasonable job making their grievances palatable to the people who pay their salaries?
I think they're making a tremendous effort to do that, and I also think that there are tremendous forces aligned against them, and I think that's a large part of the problem. I think that there are clearly a lot of people in the Canadian economy today that don't have pensions, that don't have the stability, and they've been sort of convinced that they would be better off if somehow public sector workers didn't have those things as well. It might come as a surprise to some people that per person, we're actually richer now than we were a decade ago. And a decade ago, we were richer per person than we were a decade before that. And a decade before that, we were richer per person than we were a decade back then. So in the 70s, we were actually quite poor. But you know what? I think most people would say things are a lot better than they are right now. And so I think we have to ask, what's going on that each year we can become a richer society per person, but the vast majority of us get left behind? And I think that's what the union movement is fighting against. And it's really pushing a very big boulder up a very steep hill right now.
John, you're reacting to this.
The Canadian Labour Congress surveyed 2,000 Canadians. They looked at unionized and union-free. Their data tracks back to the 1980s, and when you look at their graph, the level of interest in unionization, including asking unionized Canadians, which is 30% unionization, was 33%. Their own researcher asking their own questions of Canadians, and that's what they got. I go back to something I said earlier. The number one complaint before a Canadian Labour Board is a complaint of a unionized worker against their union. Private sector unionization means that 84% of private sector Canadians are union-free. 84%. Is this some terrible place? I worked at Future Shop. It wasn't what's been described by Lisa and others earlier on this panel, okay? CUPE tried to organize WestJet, and they didn't get in. Frank Stronach did a deal with Buzz Hargrove to make it easier to organize Magna, and they're not interested. When Europe ordered Canadian management at then DeFasco, when ArcelorMittal took over, and they asked for steel to go in, I think they went in on a Monday, and by Thursday, the people at that place said, get out. I had shared with me some of the emails directed at management, vitriolic criticism of those employees, of management, for putting the union into the workplace to try to organize them. This is one of the phenomena in the United States where companies like Johnson Controls actually let the union take advantage of the workers from an organizational point of view. That's a lack of worker choice. That's a lack of worker protection.
Pablo, do you want to respond to some of that?
Absolutely. I think first off, I'd rather not get involved in sensationalist conversations. I think it's important that we stick to some facts as opposed to the hearsay or she said this or that, right? I think that the importance here that we have to look at is that workers at the end of the day have a choice to make. And that choice is that they have to work. They have to provide for their families. And what has been, I think, criminalized or has been deemed negative sometimes by corporate pundits, and that includes corporate media, is this idea that wanting the ability to be able to subsist and provide your children with food or a house or a roof over their heads, having a decent a pension to retire, has been criminalized. And it's this idea that we pin workers against each other, and we pin the public sector worker who actually has a decent living wage, and we show that to the non-unionized worker, and we say, hey, you should be angry at them for not having that yourself. And I think what Professor Luchak is alluding to is this idea that there is increasing profits that are being had when it comes to the growth of the economy. But what we see is that there's an increasing income inequality that kind of coincides with the deterioration or the downfall of unionization rates, and that's not something that necessarily can be refuted. I mean, the OECD has produce reports that indicate that they also say that to your earlier points, this idea that unions block production or proficiency are just unequivocally untrue. And I think that the most dangerous thing that we hear, and one of the things that we have to fight against the most and has been historically the hardest thing to do, is the image. And that image is being portrayed by a corporate media that it's not a mystery that if a big corporation comes in and is buying and being able to allow your media to sustain itself because they're buying advertisement, that very same corporate outlet isn't going to publish a negative article on that.
Okay,
and
I have
the
a couple
last thing I'd like
questions.
to say is for every, and I'd invite Mr. John Mortimer to sign up for our HRED listserv, where we on a daily basis put out amazing work that's being done by our members, for our members, in our communities, but media doesn't pick that up. What they pick up is that one story that you tell.
But okay, but you said something about private sector unions being played off against public sector unions. Can you give me an example of what you mean? Give me a concrete example of that.
Of a private sector union being pinned against? I'm thinking more in terms of private sector workers versus public sector union workers.
But you're talking about the benefits of one are much greater than the benefits that are being offered to another. Therefore, there should be some sort of conflict there, correct?
Well, in the private sector, there is a lot less unionization. Unionization representation is about at 18-19% currently, I believe, whereas in the public sector, it's much higher. What we do see in the private sector is there are a lot more low-paying jobs with lesser benefits, and what's being echoed out there is the sentiment against workers that have a decent wage and have decent living conditions. And what's being played, what we hear in the media, what we're hearing on the Twitter, is this idea that because somebody has a little bit more, we should be angry with them, as opposed to looking beyond that and seeing why is it that there's this income disparity? Why is it that we're being told that we should be angry at the person that's still making only a livable wage? Not in every case does a public sector worker make this ludicrous CEO type of money. It's not that, it's a livable wage. And there's a difference between a minimum wage and a livable wage. And sometimes we're pinning that minimum wage worker to be angry at the person making a livable wage.
Okay, and the other thing that I want to pick up on is that you're very interested in communicating the things that your union is doing. And is that an admission that unions have failed in the past to indicate how they have affected, in a positive way, the society that they're a part of?
It's an admission that it hasn't been covered by the corporate media as much as they should have in the past. The admission as to whether or not we've been doing this work, at least at our union, and I know at many others, we have a history of fighting for social justice causes within our membership, within our communities, and abroad. And I do want to indicate that there have been Supreme Court cases or decisions like the Levine decision in 1991 that actually affirmed the fact that unions should have the right to participate in political activism, advocacy, and only makes it natural that they be interested in social justice issues as it affects their workers, their membership, and the broader community directly and indirectly.
One of the points in the Paths to Prosperity white paper that the Conservative Party of Ontario has put forward is this idea that young people are not getting a chance to get jobs because of the union regulations that close them off to them. Tell me how that could be changed. How do you see that, Mr. Mortimer? How do you see that as being remedied?
Well, one of the problems in this province right now is what's going on with the College of Trades, which is really, I affectionately use the term for the head of the working families, Pat Dillon. I call him Deputy Premier Pat Dillon. The College of Trades is an attempt by the Ontario government, backed by the building trades unions, to turn Ontario construction into Quebec, where everybody's unionized. And yet in Quebec, as we've seen recently by this case of this unionized worker who's been threatened and intimidated by a guy named Rambo from one union, and someone's finally stood up for this guy and brought it out. So I want to come back to touch on something that was said about the Levine decision. What the Levine decision says is that the RAND formula is a charter violation. It says it's a justifiable charter violation. If government wants to force workers to fund the NDP, then government can make that choice. And any government in this country, from the Harper government to the NDP government in Nova Scotia, could stop violating workers' charter rights and make sure that the RAND formula is exactly what Justice Rand said in 1946.
Okay,
Union
let's
dues
get back
for
to
the
the RAND
administration
formula
of the
in just
law
a
of their
second.
employment.
We can take this up in just a moment. I want to get back to bringing young people into the workforce, because the Paths to Prosperity says that they have a solution. That they're proposing something that they think will open up markets to young people, job markets to young people.
It's making sure that there's greater worker choice, that there's greater flexibility in the economy.
How do you do that?
How do you
What's
do that?
the remedy?
You make sure that this country aligns with where the rest of the world is going and in protecting workers and making sure that unionization reaches its natural levels.
By doing what? By doing what?
By banning forced union membership, by banning forced union dues for non-bargaining purposes, by making sure that unionization is by a secret ballot vote. Not two steelworkers who go into Karina Bouffard's home in a December in Sudbury and refuse to leave Karina's home until she signs her steelworker's card. And the Federal Court of Appeal said because there was no actual violence, they didn't take issue with that. Two men in a woman's home at night. It's documented. Read it in the decision.
Pablo, I want to talk about, you organized a clothing boutique in Mississauga, is that correct?
No.
Okay. Not the H&M?
Oh, I thought you meant personally, yes. United Food and Commercial Workers, yes, we did organize an H&M.
So that was younger people. You were trying to bring younger people into the union.
We weren't trying to bring them in. They were interested in being protected under the law by a union, and they came to us and approached us without being solicited.
So how do you respond to the kinds of stories that John Mortimer is telling about intimidation, about people being forced and people being tricked into joining unions or
the response cards? Again, right? We can get into sensationalist stories and go back and forth all day about them. The simple fact is that workers are looking to be protected. They are calling our offices on a daily basis and other unions because they do need this representation. I would pose the question that I don't see the alternative that's being put out there by corporate pundits or by labor side lawyers in terms of what the actual alternative would be for a worker who wants a collective voice in their workplace, where, like you said, in this case, H&M workers felt like they were being scheduled in ways that was unfair, that benefited few but not others, that didn't take in consideration personal lives. They were facing discrimination, and so they felt the need to be protected. And so they called us. It wasn't that we're going out there begging people to sign union cards. We have people knocking on our doors at a rate that we can't respond because there's so many workers out there that need protection from us. And so you can say and give us the stories of negative examples, but I can sit here all night tonight and multiply those stories immensely. I don't think that's what we're here for. I think a discussion, frankly, on workers' rights, where they stand and where their voices are at the table when it comes to negotiating their labor standards is more of importance.
Julie Chapman, I think you have some comments from our online listeners and viewers. How would you like to share them with us?
Yes, absolutely. And just what Pablo was saying right now on unions and young people has sparked some conversation on Twitter. We have Chris on Twitter saying, responding to that question, do unions matter to young people? He says, not at all. I'm non-unionized and I love it. I get treated great at work, and why have someone else in my pocket? He said they did serve a purpose and may still in a large corporate setting, but not for the little guy. We also have a commenter named Aaron on our webpage saying, the biggest problem with unions is their tendency to eat their own young. So many unions are all about seniority and nothing else. The result is a unionized environment divided between the young and the old, with the former picking up the slack for the latter. And Brent, Aaron here ends with a question. He says, how do they expect the movement to continue if they just alienate anyone who tries to join?
Let me take that question and give it to Wayne. Wayne, we're talking about a workplace, a work environment that's changing, and more small employers, more small companies working in this environment. What do you think of the question that was just posed to us by our listeners online?
Well, the change is, I don't think so much that there are more smaller employers. There are more small employers, but the large employers are offering different kinds of employment. So I'm employed by a fairly large organization in this city, McMaster University. More and more of the positions that we offer are contract, short-term jobs, limited duration employment. They're not the kind of, to be frank, privileged tenured jobs like I have. And the same would be the case like Magna, right? Magna, 20% of their workforce comes from a temp agency. So increasingly, it's also large employers that are offering a different kind of employment, and I think that's where the issue is really of coming back to young people and how are they getting jobs. I mean, the problem is not that unions are shutting young people out; it's just that there are not opportunities for young people. Full stop. That employers are not generating the kind of jobs. Either jobs at all or the kind of jobs that young people want. And unions, they can play a role in encouraging employers to change some of the terms of that employment so it is a bit more secure. So it does have a bit of a pension, so it does get some training, so it does have a future.
Edgar, you have a question.
Yes. The question is for any of the panelists. Does the federal government have a long-term strategy to resolve the labor issues? Because in the media recently, we hear the case of Royal Bank of Canada displacing 50 of its own employees to hire other foreign workers to pay them less. Secondly, on Monday's Toronto Star, Carol Gore says it's challenging the foreign workers programs as being racist because it's discriminating, paying up to 15% less to foreign workers based on their origin, ethnic origin or nationality. I need you to comment on those two issues.
I'll take this back to Wayne again because we have another question about federal programs, Wayne, and how that affects the labor market.
So does the federal government have a plan? They had a plan, and the plan was choice, free markets, let the market dictate where things are going. And if you notice in the last budget, that plan is now basically dead. That even the federal government has now admitted it has to intervene. It has to intervene in the auto sector if we're going to get any assembly plants. It has to intervene in other parts of the economy. And I think right now the federal government is at a bit loose ends. It's not quite sure what to do because it recognizes the economy is sputtering, it's stumbling. A lot of people are disenchanted. The parents can't get their kids out into the labor market. They can't get the kind of jobs they want. And so I think we're now in a transition period. And my guess is 5 years from now, we're going to see a very different kind of federal initiative than we have right now. And the signs of that is what's going on in the United States. The United States has also abandoned this kind of free market, let the chips fall where they may, and there the federal government is constantly saying, we're going to invest in green energy, we're going to encourage these kinds of sectors, and recognizing that the free market regime of the last 30 years has not produced the goodies that it was supposed to produce.
But how do we square that with the fact that 23 of the 50 United States have these right-to-work legislations, And one of the arguments that the Conservatives in Ontario are making is that as productivity costs rise in China, then the manufacturing sector is going to come back onshore again in the United States, and we have to compete with those markets. Are they going to suck up all the jobs, and do we have to follow suit with legislation that copies theirs?
Yeah, I think it would be a mistake to suggest that the right to work clauses is the main or the only thing that's driving those kinds of investments. And again, I think you need to...
What else?
Well, very clearly, the states and municipalities in the United States have powers that cities and provinces in Canada don't. And so just last week, Tennessee gave $150 million to Toyota to set up a new Lexus plant down there. The federal government has been doling out billions of dollars in the United States to encourage certain kinds of investments in different kinds of plants. So the very visible hand of the state is directing a lot of those changes. And I think it's a bit facile to suggest that somehow the right to work is the main thing that's going on, particularly when almost all the empirical evidence shows that unionized workplaces are more productive than non-unionized workplaces.
Then why is the right to work? Then why is it so popular? I mean, the right to work legislation in the United States seems to be, it runs about 70–75% in popularity when people are asked about it.
Well, I think because a lot of people don't understand the complexity of what's going on. So I think most people probably don't know that unionized workplaces are on average more productive than non-unionized workplaces. But the other part of it is that unionized workplaces are less profitable than non-union workplaces. So that's really what's going on here, that if you can get into a right-to-work state, you can make more profit, not necessarily be more productive. And as a society, what we want is more production, not necessarily more profit, because we can only consume what we produce.
I have to ask John to respond to that, though. John, what do you think?
I don't know, we've created almost 700,000 new jobs since the 08 financial problems that the world faced in this country. Yet I'm sorry, Professor, I hear dialogue that there's no jobs here, okay? So, look, here's the reality whether you want to hear it or not. Stop saying was. Stop talking about creating the weekend. Okay? An NDP cabinet minister said to me that he had a battle inside of his cabinet when the province of Manitoba went to dues checkoff, where employers would start taking the money from the worker instead of the union leader going and collecting it from people. And when they would have to pay it as a condition of employment, okay? He said the day we stop collecting the money ourselves is the day leaders stop listening. Okay? And I think you can track dissatisfaction with unions. Go look at the Canadian Labour Congress's own research. Focus on the pension plan over at UFCW, where people have been convicted, your union leadership have been convicted of improper administration of a pension plan. Focus on administering that properly. Over at CUPE, don't blow bargaining for Air Canada flight attendants as you did and necessitate the government to intervene. That was a completely dysfunctional bargaining committee. But CUPE's out there doing all sorts of things that have nothing to do with running Air Canada. Okay, and that's why they're in trouble.
I have a comment from Naveen. Naveen Mehta is with us, and he's the Director of Human Rights.
Those are the facts, sir.
Okay. Naveen Mehta is the... Please? If you have a comment, we can take it at the microphone, all right? And we'll do it that way. Naveen Mehta is the Director of the Human Rights, Equity, and Diversity at the United Food and Commercial Workers of Canada, and he's been following the conversation so far. Naveen, what do you think?
Thus far, I find it, this type of sort of destructive George Bush type rhetoric from Mr. Mortimer, as not only just painful for...
Okay, one person at a time, please, Naveen.
Not only just painful for my children and the future of Canada, but for all of our children. I think when you look at who Labour Watch Canada is, and you look at their clients, they're not the United Way. Their clients are corporate Canada. This isn't like the Obama campaign, Canadians dropping off $5 bills. This is corporate Canada getting together to send a message to make even more money. If you look on their website, all of the characters you see on their website, they're listed as employer advisors, employee advisors. They're all big Bay Street firms. They're all the law firms from across Canada that I deal with all the time. What we need to do here, I think, and what Labour Watch needs to do is really look at the facts. We've heard anecdotal evidence from Mary and Susie, and this happened. I spent 10 years litigating cases on behalf of workers. I could go on for hours, if not days, where employers in unionized environments have really just went for the jugular for a worker they didn't like. And if it wasn't for that unionized environment, that worker would be out on the street. The other quick point I want to talk about is when we take a step back from all of this, our economy runs on the basic fundamental idea that people need to earn enough money to buy the stuff that corporations are selling us. Mr. Mortimer's world would be one where we couldn't do that. And what we'd be doing is either sending the work to the slaves offshore or bringing the slaves back to Canada. We can't just look at these arguments in a vacuum, because that's not the way they work. Everything is interconnected. Lower wages mean lower incomes, lower tax base. Lower tax base means less money for infrastructure, poor health care, and poor education.
But Naveen, these are the policies that are being put forward as probably an election platform in the next provincial election here in Ontario. I mean, when you're using language like a slave economy, that sounds fairly inflammatory. But this has a mainstream. This has a very mainstream push behind it. So how do you respond to that? How has this entered the mainstream if it's as extreme as you are portraying it?
When I'm talking about the slaves, I'm talking about the 250,000 temporary foreign workers that we bring into the country every year to do the work that we allegedly don't want Canadians to do. And the way that system works in a Hudak world, in a Harper world, is that Canadians are told, well, you can come apply for these jobs. They used to pay $20 an hour, but we're giving you 10 right now. And guess what? Canadians can't afford to work at those levels. Those are the slaves that I'm talking about. And the work that's sent to indentured servitude, to indentured laborers on the other side of the planet. Because we can't produce these items anymore, because in Mr. Mortimer's world, and his corporate cronies' world, we're talking about the race to the bottom. This is a world where, on Twitter, on Facebook, we can talk about the protections that unions used to have, the protections that unions not being relevant. It's all nonsensical when we look at the facts today, right now. And I'd really want Mr. Mortimer to stop relying on anecdotes, because I can do that for hours and hours, and let's look at real facts and real statistics. Across the planet, there is an absolute correlation between higher standards of living and higher rates of unionization. There's an absolute correlation. There's a book by Richard Wilkinson, we should all read it. There's an absolute correlation between the rate of infant mortality. The higher the rate of infant mortality, the lower the rate of unionization. The higher the rate of unionization, the higher the rate of healthcare. These are just statistics.
Okay, I have to. So
Absolutely.
You're obviously saying that what is at stake here is the quality of life for a large segment of the middle and working classes. But you're also, I have to give Mr. Mortimer a chance to respond to what you're saying about who's funding him and what his aim is. And that is, Mr. Mortimer, he's basically saying that you're here because you're a representative of corporate Canada. Is that accurate?
Our members are publicly listed on our website. We function on $50,000 to $100,000 a year. That's it. You're going to let me finish, okay? Okay? If we're going to start throwing out words like slaves, you're just going to damage your credibility, okay? I serve as the president of Labour Watch on a part-time basis. We're there as a result of a network of volunteers. That's the bottom line. We've been around for 13 years, okay? 47 nations in Europe don't allow what's allowed in Canada. New Zealand doesn't allow it, and Australia doesn't allow it. It's only a matter of time. You need to figure out a different paradigm. You need to figure out a different relevance, because Canadians don't think you're relevant.
Okay.
And I think you should stop working on a lot of the things you're working on and serve the workers who pay your wages. Don't go to the legislature and fight secret ballot votes when most unionized Canadians want secret ballot votes. Go look at the Canadian Labour Congress's own research on the criticisms that people make of their union leadership. Take it to heart and change your focus.
Okay,
That's what we're about.
I'm going back to the audience, and if you have a comment, please bring it to the microphone. Don't yell it out, because people can't hear you at home, and we want to share it with everyone. And we have someone at the microphone now. Sir, what's your name?
Yeah, good evening. My name is Mark Newman. I'm the unit chair of the Hamilton Community News group here in Hamilton. We're part of the Southern Ontario News Media Guild, which is part of CEP, which will soon be part of something else. And I've been in the news business for 30 years, and right around the corner from here, there's a place called Neighbor to Neighbor Center. They run a food bank. I know this because I've written numerous articles about them. They tell me that they serve 1,300 to 1,400 households per month on Hamilton Mountain. They also tell me that the majority of their clients are employed, but they're the working poor. They all work for minimum wage jobs. So all of their money goes to rent. They can't afford to eat. They have to go to the food bank. And if we're going to have this, I'm going to call it neocon philosophy imposed upon us, then food banks like Neighbor to Neighbor Center are going to start serving 2,000 households per month. Because those people cannot afford to buy groceries, they cannot afford to buy homes, they cannot afford to shop at the mom and pop small businesses on Hamilton Mountain, they cannot afford to buy cars, they cannot afford to go on vacation, they cannot afford to contribute to the economy. So I just want people to think about that, because that is the reality that I cover. And I just want to say, as I guess a union leader, I haven't eaten anybody's young recently. And I also want to make a point that I learned a long time ago that in my position, and it's a voluntary position, I don't get, big bucks for doing this. This is voluntary, and I want to make the point that a lot of people in the union movement do this because they believe in it. It's not because they get paid big bucks for doing it. Yes, we have staffers, people who help, but in the workplace, the stewards and the presidents and the chairs and the vice chairs, we do it for nothing. We don't get paid for this. This is on top of our regular jobs. Now, I learned a long time ago that I really don't have to extol the virtues of being part of a union. I just wait, because the company will do that for me. Because I can give you a list of names who many years ago wouldn't cross the street to talk to me at a union meeting. But I wait long enough, and sure enough, they will come, because sooner or later they will have an issue, and we deal with it. And that's, as I say, the company is my best recruiter, not the union. And I just want to make that a point. And I don't want to say this in a negative way, because I'll be frank, we get along quite well with the management at our company. We've gone through 2 rounds of bargaining, no strike votes, no animosity, contract settled, no big deal. And I'll bet you that happens 90% of the time in organized labor. We hear about the strikes and the fights and the goofy stuff, and sure it happens. But the goofy stuff happens everywhere. I mean, do we hear about, all the corporate Ponzi schemes going on? We talk a few $100,000 here or a few $100,000 there at organized labor, but what about the hundreds of millions of dollars that are being stolen by the corporate people? You saw the meltdown on Wall Street that affected us, and no one's gone to jail for that. That's what drives us nuts. Now, I want to touch on briefly, because I got wound up here. We talked about the downsizing of the steel industry. Well, I want to talk about the downsizing of the media industry in Canada, which has affected our members. We've seen it at all the major dailies. We've seen it at the weeklies, the communities. The media, number of reporters, the number of newsrooms in this country is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And I'm just curious, from the panel's perspective, how does that reflect accurately reporting on not just labor issues, but news in general? Because if you don't have reporters out covering stuff who have the training to ask the questions, and you're relying on blogs and Facebook, which are not that. Those people have an agenda, and they're expressing point of view and not reporting, because there is a difference. There's no objectivity. And my question to everybody is, has the downsizing of the media industry affected what you do? And before I finish, I want to make the point, the media industry isn't losing money. They're just not making as much as they would like to make, okay? I know in the company I work for, companies are going to have to get used to maybe 10 or 15% profits instead of 30, 40, 50% profits that they were dealing with 10 years ago. But they're still making a profit. They're not hemorrhaging money.
It's a very good example
So my point is, with a shrinking media, we talked about corporate media, and I understand what you're saying, because there are fewer news reporters in this country than there were 3 years ago.
Okay.
So my question is to everybody, have you seen it? Has it affected you? Can you see just the lack of journalism out there because it's getting smaller. The messages aren't getting out, or the message isn't getting out correctly.
Thank you very much for your comments and also for your question. And Pablo, you actually touched on this earlier when you were talking about the way that you perceive labor to be portrayed in media. So why don't you address this question?
Well, yeah, I think there's a misproportionate amount of journalism that's done to sensationalize any negative experiences that unions might have or be involved with, and that sometimes includes the ones that are driven by employers and not have anything to do with necessarily what unions have done. In terms of having access or a decreasing amount of people that are able to report, I think it has a profound effect on reporting on people's issues and workers' issues, because if there is no money there to be had, I think it'd be obvious, the obvious correlation there is media is going to run where the money is, because it puts more money into the profit-making scheme that is corporate media. And so, yeah, there is a direct effect on being able to cover labor, community issues.
I just want to comment on something that our last speaker from the floor talked about, and that's precarious employment. You talked about the working poor, and these are people who have jobs but still can't afford food. Precarious employment also exists in white-collar jobs now, and I think Brad Walchuk can address this for us. Brad he taught at Brock at St. Catharines. He's teaching political science and labor studies at McMaster now. Is that correct? So do you have a microphone, Brad? Can you tell us a little bit about how that is part of your experience?
Well, yeah, certainly precarious employment exists in most fields, and I want to bring us back full circle. The question we started off with tonight was, are unions still useful?
Yeah.
And there was a major report that came out that Professor Luchuk was instrumental in bringing forward that found that 50% of workers in the Hamilton and Toronto area were precariously employed. And this exists not...
50%.
50%. This exists not simply in fast food establishments and the retail sector. This exists across the private sector and the public sector. And it certainly exists in the universities, for example. I work now with QP Local 3906 at McMaster. We represent teaching assistants and sessional instructors. Our sessional instructors have job security where they're applying on a term-to-term basis. Every 4 months, every 8 months. In other words, there is no job security for these workers. These workers are precariously employed, and about as precariously employed as you can get. The most job security that many of our members have, these are people with master's degrees, these are people enrolled in doctoral programs, these are people with completed PhDs. The most job security they have is 2 terms of employment, and then constantly they're reapplying for their job again and again and again, regardless of how long they've been working at the university. This exists at McMaster, and it certainly exists at most universities across Ontario. So when we get back to that original question, are unions still useful? When we're at the bargaining table, when we're having surveys with our members, when we're engaging with our members and saying, what is it that you value, what is it that you find important, job security consistently comes up as the #1 issue. And if there's any hope in getting job security for workers, it is at the bargaining table, it is through organized labor, and unions are instrumental in giving workers job security, a basic level of job security.
Thank you. Brad Walchuk, who works at the Employee Service Association for QP Local 3906 here in Hamilton. Dominic is at the microphone. And Dominic, do you have a question for our panel?
Yes, I'd like just to state a few comments that I think we all share in this room and end it off with a question. I think we all share the same thoughts about higher wages and employees earning the highest wage possible. I'm an open shop contractor in Hamilton. I employ over 70 open shop employees. Over 20% of my employees have earned over 6 figures last year. My average employment compared to Stats Canada, I'm above the union average. I haven't done this simply because I wanted to. This is a market-driven economy, and as Mr. Mortimer said, it's a changing economy. I've invested in my business in the form of employee training, technology, new equipment, innovative materials. That set me above the average union or non-union employer. I hear a lot of comments up here. We share. The professor said, we are a richer economy. We grow richer by the decade. So it has no correlation to the unions. When I look at the unions, and myself, I was a union contractor 12 years ago, my employees decided to vote the union out. And we became an open shop employer. And that's when our productivity actually went up, not down. So I am a fact. Mr. Devine wanted facts, and I decided to raise my hand and state several facts. But I'd like to end up with a question. we're all about democracy. We live in one of the best democratic countries in the democratic economies in the country, and the question I would be to the Employee Teachers Union representative.
Lisa Hammond, yeah.
Yeah, Lisa, thank you. How is it that $60 from every union member from your organization were forced to donate to the working families to bring a government into power, the same government that you want out of power today? Was that democratically voted? I'm not sure if it really was.
So the answer is yes. So we are a democratic organization, and our members make the decisions about how our union spends its money.
So they influenced a government that a lot of your members don't want, because I've talked to a lot of teachers that did not know they donated $60 of their hard-earned money through their union dues. And then when they found out that same government removed their collective bargaining rights, they were outraged. And that outrage has escalated as a result of some of the decisions that your executive and other executive members have made. So what I'm trying to tell you is, we need to follow the motto of the title, why we're here this evening. Do unions, are they relevant? Let's stop looking at, yes, they benefited us. They provided an 8-hour day. They provided the 36 and 40-hour work week and the wages and the benefits and the pensions and all the great stuff that my dad has. But if we're lying to our members and we're disservicing them, we're going to continue to shrink.
I'm going to ask Lisa, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I can only respond by saying that we're not lying to our members. Our members vote on these issues. Unions are extremely democratic. The members vote. And that's how these decisions are made. So I think that notion that we lie to our members and that we hide our money, we've talked about that earlier, is false. It's all part of the anti-union propaganda that's out there right now that's trying to discredit unions. So if members want to engage and vote, that's exactly what they do.
Audience, our time is almost up, and I'd like to thank you for being such a great audience in the hall, for your incisive questions, for the difference of opinion, for being respectful of other people's opinion. You've been a great audience. And our online audience, I hope that you'll continue. You can continue on our site. There's a vigorous discussion going on there, and it would be great if it continued beyond the duration of this town hall. But I'd like to close tonight by asking each of our 4 panelists to I want to ask the same question that Dominic just asked and that I asked from in the beginning of the evening. Do unions still matter? And did anything that you hear tonight deepen your conviction that you've been sharing with us? And I'll start with you, John Mortimer.
What I heard tonight from union leaders are the types of things that are written to me about the unionized Canadians that phone me and talk about their disenchantment that shows up in the Canadian Labour Congress's own research and elsewhere. And so I think union relevance will continue to decline. I think unions will continue to matter less as long as unions can coerce membership and can coerce dues and use them for things that have nothing to do with what Justice Rand said dues should be used for. You can boo me, okay, but you're in decline, okay? And you are not satisfying a lot of the people. And a lot of young people, they don't want to have anything to do with unions.
Wayne Luchuk. Thank you, John. Wayne Luchuk.
Yeah, I think unions matter a lot, and I think they're going to matter more and more in the future. They're going to be different than they are today. They're going to be different than they are today because the labor market is going to be different tomorrow than it is today. Brad referred to the study that we completed, a little self-promotion. You can get it at www.pepso.ca, and it's called "It's More Than Poverty." And really, what it showed that of people between the ages of 25 and 65, only half could tell us, "I have a full-time job that pays me some benefits that I expect to have in a year." And those are the kind of jobs that really were the basis of the kind of society that we built in Canada in the post-World War II period. And what the study showed is that when you don't have those kind of jobs, it's hard to form a family. It's difficult to start thinking about having kids. You can't get a mortgage from the bank. You don't have any security. You can't participate in your community. And so I think one of the things that unions have to understand, have to figure out, because I don't think they have yet, they have to figure out is how do they tap into those 50% of people who don't have permanent jobs with benefits that they expect to have in a year. And when they figure that out, then they'll be a force to be reckoned with again in our society.
Lisa Hammond.
Well, yes, I do think they matter very much. And I want to say that I think they matter especially to young people. In our union, The young teachers are the ones who are directly attacked by the government. The terms that were imposed took benefits out of their pockets. It's their pension that's been affected. They've lost the things that that those of us who have been around for a long time still have. So those new members in our union are very engaged, and they have just learned a very important lesson in what will happen to you and who is going to protect you, and it's going to be their union.
Pablo Godoy is the youngest member of our panel. Last word goes to you.
Absolutely, 100% unequivocally, unions matter and will continue to matter as long as there's a labor relation between an employer and an employee. There has to be a mechanism to actually enforce the law when it comes to negotiating employees' conditions with their employers. Employers can't have open gambit or carte blanche to enforce or to inflict their workforce with whichever working conditions they'd like. Workers have to have a collective voice and will continue to seek that collective voice through one of the most democratic institutions that exist. In fact, there are studies that have shown to reflect that unions not only enhance democratic participation within their own institution, but overall. And so unions will continue to be important until jobs cease to exist, and I don't see that happening. So unions will continue to play a vital role to the existence of the workforce.
You've been listening to Labor Pains, Do Unions Still Matter? A special town hall and webcast at Mohawk College, hosted by CBC Hamilton. And I'd like to thank our four panelists: Pablo Godoy, National Representative of the Canadian Food and Commercial Workers, Vice President of Workers of Color with the Ontario Federation of Labour; Lisa Hammond, President of the Hamilton Wentworth Elementary Teachers Union; Wayne Luchuk, Professor of Labour Studies and Economics at McMaster University, co-director of the Poverty and Employment Precarity in Southern Ontario Research Project; and John Mortimer, President of the Canadian Labour Watch Association. Let's have a hand for all of them. And thanks to you, our audience here at Mohawk College, and to everyone with us online for being with us. The town hall was produced by Karen Chikaluk with Tinaz Javid and David Bruce. Our technical director was Bill Robertson. Thanks also to the excellent technical crew, including switcher director Joe Musitz and Ian Terrio on sound, as well as camera and audience producers from the journalism and broadcasting program here at Mohawk College under the direction of Pat Hansen and Ross Shimon. Many thanks to Judy Lee of CBC Communications. The team at CBC Hamilton deserves a lot of credit. Fred Youngs, Rich Hughes, Ian Johnson, Bill Knott, Samantha Craggs, Julia Chapman, Adam Carter, Corey Ruff, Conrad Colasso, and Kevin Gamble. And thanks to you on behalf of all the people who have jobs or would like to have them for caring enough to participate in this very important discussion. You've been a great audience. Hamilton, we love you. I'm Brent Bambury. Thank you for listening. Good night, everybody.
Oh, I knew it would be.
You too.
Thanks.
What's that?